Maria wiped down the same table for the third time, her mind wandering as she polished the already spotless surface. The lunch rush at Romano's Italian restaurant had ended an hour ago, and now the dining room settled into that peaceful quiet that only came between the busy periods. She loved these moments, when she could actually hear herself think instead of juggling orders and racing between tables. At 28, Maria had been working at Romano's for almost 4 years now. 4 years of, "Good evening, welcome to Romano's," and "Can I start you off with something to drink?" 4 years of carrying heavy trays and forcing smiles even when her feet screamed in protest. But it wasn't the work that bothered her. She'd always been a hard worker. It was the feeling that she was invisible, just part of the background scenery that people barely noticed. The customers who came through those doors saw her uniform first, the crisp white shirt, black pants, and the little apron tied around her waist. They saw the notepad in her hand and the pen tucked behind her ear. What they didn't see was the music that lived inside her head, the melodies that danced through her thoughts as she moved from table to table. Maria glanced toward the corner of the dining room where the piano sat. It was a beautiful instrument, a gleaming black baby grand that Mr. Romano had bought at an estate sale 3 years ago. "Adds class to the place," he'd said when it arrived. "Makes people think they're somewhere fancy." The piano had cost him a small fortune to move in and tune, but it had never been played. Not once. It was just decoration, like the fake plants and the paintings of Italian countryside that hung on the walls. But Maria knew that piano was real. During her breaks, when the restaurant was empty and Mr. Romano was busy in his office, she would sometimes run her fingers along its keys, not pressing them, just touching them. She could tell by the weight of the keys and the way they felt under her fingertips that this was a quality instrument. It deserved to be played. The truth was, Maria had been playing piano since she was 7 years old. Not because her parents could afford lessons, they couldn't. Not because she went to some fancy music school, she didn't. She learned because old Mrs. Peterson down the hall from their apartment had taken pity on a little girl who would press her ear to the wall every afternoon to listen to her practice. Mrs. Peterson had been a piano teacher for 40 years before she retired. She'd taught hundreds of students, most of them kids whose parents paid good money for proper lessons. But there was something special about Maria. Something in the way the little girl's eyes lit up when she heard music. The way she would hum along perfectly to melodies she'd only heard once. "You've got something special, little one," Mrs. Peterson had told her on that first day when Maria finally worked up the courage to knock on her door. "Something that can't be taught, but we can work with what you've got." And work they did. Every day after school, Maria would rush home, finish her homework as fast as possible, and then slip down the hall to Mrs. Peterson's apartment. The old woman's piano was nothing like the beautiful instrument that now sat in Romano's. It was an old upright with keys that stuck and pedals that squeaked. But to Maria, it might as well have been a concert grand at Carnegie Hall. Mrs. Peterson taught her the basics, how to read music, proper finger placement, scales, and exercises. But more than that, she taught Maria to feel the music. "Playing piano isn't just about hitting the right keys," she would say. "It's about telling a story. Every song has something to say, and your job is to help it speak." Maria learned everything she could from Mrs. Peterson. Classical pieces by Mozart and Chopin, jazz standards from the old days, popular songs from the radio. When Mrs. Peterson passed away during Maria's senior year of high school, she left behind all her sheet music and a promise that Maria would never stop playing. But life has a way of getting in the way of dreams. Maria's parents needed help with bills. Her younger brother needed money for college. There wasn't time for music when there were real responsibilities to handle. So Maria put her dreams in a box, tucked them away in the back of her heart, and got a job. She'd worked at a grocery store first, then a department store, then finally landed the waitressing job at Romano's. The pay was decent with tips, and the hours were flexible enough that she could help her family when they needed it. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it was a good life, an honest life. Still, the music never really went away. It was always there, humming quietly in the background of her thoughts. When she walked, her steps fell into rhythm. When she worked, Her hands moved like she was conducting an invisible orchestra. And sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would pull out the old sheet music Mrs. Peterson had left her and run through the pieces in her mind, her fingers moving silently on her bedsheets as if they were keys. The other waitresses at Romano's were nice enough. There was Linda, who'd been there since the restaurant opened and knew every regular customer by name. There was Jennifer, fresh out of college and saving money for graduate school. There was Carmen, a single mom who worked double shifts to support her 2 kids. They were all good people, working hard to get by. But Maria couldn't really talk to them about music. They wouldn't understand. The customers were a mixed bunch. Romano's attracted everyone from young couples on dates to business people closing deals over dinner. Most were polite enough, though some barely looked at her when they ordered. She was just the waitress, there to bring food and disappear. Maria had gotten used to being invisible. But the piano saw her. Every time she looked at it, she felt like it was looking back, waiting patiently for someone to bring it to life. Sometimes she caught herself staring at it so intently that customers had to repeat their orders. She would apologize and focus back on her work, but her eyes always drifted back to that corner of the room. Mr. Romano had mentioned once that he wished he could find someone to play it occasionally. Would class up the joint, he'd said. But you know how musicians are. They want too much money and half of them show up late or don't show up at all. Maria had thought about mentioning that she could play, but something always held her back. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she'd forgotten too much? What if Mr. Romano laughed at the idea of his waitress thinking she could play piano? So she kept quiet and kept working. She took orders, served food, cleared tables, and went home to her small apartment every night with her secret still safely locked away. The music in her head grew a little quieter each day, but it never completely disappeared. It was still there, waiting. Maria didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. In just a few days, Romano's would host a dinner party that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself. She would be forced to choose between staying invisible and stepping into the light, between playing it safe and taking the biggest risk of her life. But for now, she was just Maria the waitress, polishing tables and stealing glances at a piano that sat silent in the corner, both of them waiting for their moment to shine. As she finished wiping down the last table and prepared for the dinner rush, Maria hummed softly to herself, a melody that Mrs. Peterson had taught her years ago. She didn't realize it, but across the dining room, the piano seemed to be listening, its keys catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows, ready and waiting for the hands that would soon bring it back to life. Friday evening at Romano's was always busy, but tonight felt different. Maria could sense the energy in the air as soon as she walked into work. Mr. Romano was bustling around more than usual, straightening chairs and adjusting the lighting. Linda, the senior waitress, was setting up a large table in the center of the dining room with extra care, making sure every glass sparkled and every fork was perfectly aligned. "Big night tonight," Mr. Romano announced to his staff as they gathered for their pre-shift meeting. "We've got David Kim coming in with a group of his friends. You know who that is, right?" He looked around at the blank faces staring back at him. "He's that big-shot music producer, works with all the famous singers. This could be really good for business if we impress him." Maria felt a flutter in her stomach at the mention of music, but she pushed the feeling down. She had tables to serve and tips to earn. Whatever was happening tonight, she just needed to do her job and stay out of the way. The group arrived at 7:30 sharp. David Kim was a well-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive-looking glasses. He moved with the confidence of someone who was used to being the most important person in the room. With him came 7 other people, men and women who all seemed to share that same air of sophistication and success. Maria was assigned to serve their table, and as she approached with menus and water glasses, she couldn't help but overhear their conversation. They were talking about music in a way she'd rarely heard, discussing composers and symphonies and concert halls with the casual familiarity that most people reserved for talking about the weather. "The problem with music today," said a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, is that everyone thinks they can just download an app and call themselves a musician. There's no respect for real training anymore. A thin man with a carefully trimmed beard nodded in agreement. Exactly, Victoria. When I was studying at Juilliard, we understood that music was a craft that required years of dedication. Now kids think they can become famous by posting videos online. Maria set down the water glasses as quietly as possible, trying not to interrupt their conversation. But inside, she felt a pang of something. Hurt, maybe, or anger. These people were talking about music like it belonged only to them. Like anyone who hadn't gone to fancy schools or had expensive lessons couldn't possibly understand what real music was. The man with the beard? She'd heard someone call him. Richard, continued his lecture. I was just telling someone the other day that true musical talent is becoming extinct. People don't appreciate the years of study it takes to truly master an instrument. They think playing a few chords makes them an artist. Oh, don't get me started on that, laughed another woman, this one with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. I went to a coffee shop last week where some college kid was playing guitar and singing. The entire place was clapping along like he was the next Mozart. It was painful to watch. David Kim smiled indulgently at his friend's complaints. Now, let's not be too harsh. There's always been amateur music alongside the professional world. The real artists will always rise to the top. But that's just it, David, Richard insisted, his voice getting louder and more passionate. How can real artists rise when the public doesn't know the difference between genuine skill and just making noise? I guarantee you could walk into any restaurant in this city, even this one, and ask 100 people to play piano and maybe one of them could manage Happy Birthday without hitting wrong notes. The group erupted in laughter at this comment. Maria felt her cheeks burn as she pretended to be busy arranging the silverware. She wanted to walk away, but she had a job to do. She took a deep breath and approached the table with her notepad. Ready. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Romano's. Can I start you off with some appetizers or drinks from the bar? The conversation paused as they looked up at her, or rather through her. Maria was used to this. To customers like these, she was part of the furniture, useful, but not really there as a person. I'll have the wine list, said Victoria without really looking at Maria. Something Italian, obviously, since we're in an Italian restaurant. Of course, Maria replied politely. I'll bring that right over. As she walked away to get the wine list, she heard the conversation resume behind her. But now they'd moved on to a new topic that made her stomach clench even tighter. Speaking of music, said the woman with the dark hair. Did you see that piano over there? She gestured toward the corner where the beautiful black piano sat. What a waste. I bet it hasn't been played in years. Richard followed her gaze and shook his head sadly. Criminal, really. An instrument like that should be making music, not gathering dust. But I suppose it's just for show. Probably couldn't find anyone in this neighborhood who could actually play it properly. Oh, come on, Richard, laughed David Kim. You're being dramatic. I'm sure there are plenty of capable piano players around. Are there, though? Richard challenged. Real players, I mean. Not just people who can peck out chopsticks or play along to YouTube tutorials. I'm talking about musicians who understand structure, who can read music fluently, who have the technical skill to handle complex pieces. Victoria raised her wine glass in agreement. Richard's right. Real piano playing is an art form. It requires years of proper training, understanding of classical technique, knowledge of music theory. You can't just sit down and play, not really play, without that foundation. Maria returned with the wine list, her hands trembling slightly as she set it on the table. She tried to focus on taking their dinner orders, but their words kept echoing in her head. They were so certain that people like her, people without formal training, people who worked regular jobs, couldn't possibly understand real music. I'll have the ossobuco, Richard was saying. And let me ask you something. He looked directly at Maria for the first time all evening. That piano over there, does anyone ever play it? Maria's heart jumped. Not usually, no. It's mostly decorative. Exactly my point, Richard said, turning back to his friends with a satisfied expression. Beautiful instrument, completely wasted. Probably not a single person in this entire restaurant who could do it justice. What would you consider doing it justice? Asked David Kim with genuine curiosity. Richard warmed to his subject. Well, at minimum, you'd need someone who could play a proper classical piece. Nothing too complicated, maybe some Chopin or a Bach invention. Something that requires actual technique and musical understanding. But I'd bet my season tickets to the symphony that you couldn't find anyone in this whole neighborhood who could manage even that. The table murmured their agreement. They seemed to enjoy this game, imagining how superior their musical knowledge was compared to everyone around them. Maria finished taking their orders and escaped to the kitchen, her heart pounding. She felt angry and hurt and frustrated all at once. These people were talking about music like it was some exclusive club that only they belonged to. They had no idea that just 10 feet away from them stood someone who could play every piece they'd mentioned, and play them well. But what bothered her even more was a tiny voice in the back of her head that whispered, maybe they were right. Maybe 4 years of not playing had made her forget too much. Maybe without formal training she really wasn't good enough. Maybe she was just kidding herself about her abilities. The dinner service continued, and Maria did her best to stay professional. She served their appetizers, refilled their wine glasses, and tried to ignore their ongoing commentary about the decline of musical standards in modern society. But every word felt like a small cut, each dismissive comment another reason to keep her abilities hidden. As the evening wore on, the group grew more animated and their opinions more pronounced. They'd moved from complaining about amateur musicians to lamenting the general public's inability to recognize true talent when they heard it. The problem, Richard declared as Maria served their main courses, is that people today have no ear for quality. They've been so exposed to synthetic music and auto-tuned vocals that they wouldn't recognize genuine artistry if it walked up and performed right in front of them. Absolutely, agreed Victoria. Give them a real pianist playing a real piece on a real piano, and they'd probably just ignore it. They're more interested in whatever's trending on social media than in actual musical achievement. David Kim nodded thoughtfully. It's sad, really. All this technology was supposed to make music more accessible, but instead it's made people less appreciative of real skill and dedication. Maria set down Richard's plate with steady hands, even though inside she felt like screaming. These people had no idea what they were talking about. They assumed that anyone who wasn't part of their world couldn't possibly understand or appreciate real music. They were so wrapped up in their own superiority that they couldn't imagine talent existing outside their narrow definition of what qualified as real musical education. But as much as their words stung, they also lit a fire inside her that had been smoldering for years. Every dismissive comment, every assumption about what people like her could or couldn't do, fed a growing determination that she'd been trying to suppress. The evening was winding down at Romano's, and Maria felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with carrying heavy trays or being on her feet for hours. The words from David Kim's table had been echoing in her head all night, each dismissive comment about real musicians and proper training hitting her like a small slap. Most of the other tables had finished their meals and left. The kitchen staff was starting their closing routine, the clatter of pots and pans mixing with the low hum of conversation from the few remaining customers. Maria was clearing empty tables and trying to push down the frustrated energy that had been building inside her all evening. Richard's voice carried across the dining room as she worked. He'd had quite a bit of wine with dinner, and his opinions had grown even more pronounced as the night went on. You know what the real tragedy is, he was saying to his companions, gesturing broadly with his wine glass. It's not just that people don't appreciate good music anymore, it's that they've convinced themselves they don't need to. They think music is just background noise, something to fill the silence while they scroll through their phones. Victoria nodded sagely. Exactly. Music used to be something special, something that required your full attention. Now it's just another form of entertainment, like watching cat videos. David Kim looked around the restaurant, his gaze eventually settling on the piano in the corner. Take that instrument, for example. In another era, that would have been the centerpiece of the evening. People would have gathered around it, requested their favorite songs, appreciated the skill required to play it properly. But not anymore, added the woman with the dark hair. Maria had learned her name was Patricia during dinner service. Now it's just expensive furniture. I doubt anyone in this entire place has even touched those keys. Richard laughed loudly at this. Touched them? Patricia, I'd be willing to bet that nobody in this restaurant, not the customers, not the staff, probably not even the owner, could play a single song on that piano. Not properly anyway. Come on, Richard, David said with a smile. You're being too harsh. Surely someone could manage something simple. Like what? Richard challenged. And I don't mean pecking out Mary Had a Little Lamb with one finger. I mean actually playing, both hands, proper technique, reading music. Something that would actually sound like music instead of noise. The conversation had grown loud enough that other people in the restaurant were starting to look over. Maria noticed an elderly couple at a corner table shaking their heads disapprovingly at the volume of Richard's voice. A young family with 2 small children were clearly ready to leave, but seemed reluctant to walk past the boisterous table. I'll tell you what, Richard continued, his voice getting even louder. I'll put money on it. $100 says nobody in this entire restaurant could sit down at that piano and play a single classical piece from start to finish. Not one person. Richard, keep your voice down, Victoria whispered, finally noticing that they were attracting attention. Why should I? Richard asked. It's not like I'm wrong. Look around this place. These are regular people. Waitresses, cooks, customers just trying to have a nice dinner. They're good people, I'm sure, but they're not musicians. They don't have the training, the knowledge, the years of practice it takes to really play piano. Maria's hands tightened around the plates she was carrying. She'd been trying to ignore the conversation, trying to focus on her work and get through the rest of her shift. But something about the way Richard said, waitresses, like it was impossible for someone with her job to have any other skills or talents, made her blood boil. You're absolutely right, Patricia chimed in. I mean, no offense to anyone here, but playing piano at a professional level requires a specific type of education and background. You don't just wake up one day and decide to be a pianist. David Kim seemed slightly uncomfortable with how loud his friends had become, but he didn't try to stop them. Well, I suppose there's always the possibility of natural talent. Natural talent only goes so far, Richard interrupted. Without proper training, without understanding music theory and classical technique, natural talent is just noise. Pretty noise maybe, but still just noise. Maria set the plates down at an empty table and took a deep breath. Her heart was racing, and she could feel her face getting hot. She'd dealt with difficult customers before, but this was different. These people weren't just being rude to her. They were dismissing everything she'd ever worked for, everything Mrs. Peterson had taught her, everything music meant to her. She glanced toward the piano, its black surface reflecting the warm light from the restaurant's chandeliers. She could see her own reflection in its polished wood, distorted but unmistakable. For a moment she imagined herself sitting on that bench, her fingers finding the familiar keys, the music flowing through her the way it used to. But then reality crashed back in. What if Richard was right? What if 4 years of not playing regularly had made her rusty? What if she sat down and embarrassed herself, proving their point about untrained amateurs? What if she'd been kidding herself all these years about her abilities? The thing is, Richard was saying now, his voice carrying clearly across the nearly empty restaurant, most people don't even realize how much they don't know about music. They hear someone playing and they think, oh, that sounds nice, but they have no idea whether it's actually any good or not. They can't tell the difference between someone who's really playing and someone who's just hitting keys. That did it. Maria wasn't sure exactly what happened in that moment. Maybe it was the condescending tone in Richard's voice. Maybe it was the way the whole table had spent the evening acting like they were the only people in the world who understood music. Maybe it was 4 years of keeping her talents hidden, 4 years of pretending to be just a waitress when she knew she was so much more. Or maybe it was the memory of Mrs. Peterson's voice, telling her years ago that music wasn't about fancy schools or expensive lessons. It was about feeling, about passion, about having something to say and finding a way to say it. Whatever it was, Maria felt something shift inside her. The nervous energy that had been building all evening suddenly crystallized into a calm, clear determination. She looked around the restaurant. The other staff members were in the back cleaning up. Mr. Romano was in his office counting the night's receipts, and only a few customers remained. The timing felt almost like fate. Maria walked over to her section and finished clearing the last of her tables. Her movements were deliberate now, purposeful. She could hear Richard's voice continuing in the background, but the words no longer stung. Instead, they fueled the quiet fire that was growing in her chest. She approached David Kim's table to ask if they needed anything else. The conversation paused as she reached them, 8 pairs of eyes looking up at her with that familiar, blank stare she'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Can I get you anything else this evening?" she asked politely. "Just the check," David replied. "It's been a lovely meal." "Of course," Maria said. "I'll bring that right over." But instead of walking toward the register, Maria found herself walking toward the corner of the restaurant, toward the piano. She heard the conversation at the table pause behind her. She was aware of other people in the restaurant starting to notice her movement. The elderly couple looked curious. The family with children had stopped putting on their coats. Even some of the kitchen staff had poked their heads out to see what was happening. Maria reached the piano and stood there for a moment, looking down at the keys. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished black surface. This was it. The moment she'd been avoiding for 4 years. The moment when she either proved to herself that she still had what it took, or confirmed her worst fears about letting her skills fade away. She could hear Richard's voice behind her. "What's the waitress doing?" Without turning around, without explaining herself, without asking permission, Maria pulled out the piano bench and sat down. The familiar weight of the bench beneath her, the perfect height that put her hands at just the right angle to the keys, it all came flooding back. She lifted the piano's fallboard, revealing the full keyboard. 88 keys stretched out before her, black and white, waiting. She placed her hands in position, fingers curved the way Mrs. Peterson had taught her all those years ago. The restaurant had gone completely quiet now. Even the sounds from the kitchen had stopped. Maria could feel every eye in the place on her, but somehow that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the music that was about to fill this space. Music that had been waiting inside her for 4 long years to be set free. Maria closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let her fingers find the first chord. The sound that emerged from the piano was rich and full and absolutely perfect. Not the tentative pecking of an amateur, not the halting melody of someone unsure of themselves. This was the sound of someone who understood the instrument, who had spent countless hours learning its voice, who had something real to say through its keys. Richard's voice had stopped mid-sentence. The restaurant held its breath, and Maria began to play. The first notes that flowed from Maria's fingers were gentle, almost tentative. She began with Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that Mrs. Peterson had taught her when she was 16. It had been her favorite back then. Something about its dreamy, flowing melody spoke to the part of her that believed music could transport you anywhere. As her fingers found their rhythm on the keys, Maria felt 4 years of doubt and hesitation melting away. The muscle memory was still there, stronger than she dared to hope. Her left hand moved confidently through the bass notes while her right hand sang out the melody, each phrase flowing naturally into the next. The restaurant had fallen completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their cleaning to listen. Maria could sense the attention, but instead of making her nervous, it seemed to fuel her confidence. This was what she'd been meant to do. This was who she really was, underneath the waitress uniform and the years of hiding. The nocturne built to its gentle climax, Maria's hands dancing across the keys with increasing confidence. She added subtle touches that she'd learned from years of listening to recordings. A slight delay here, a delicate emphasis there. This wasn't just playing the notes. This was interpreting the music, making it her own. Behind her she could hear someone whisper, "Oh my God." But she didn't turn around. She was lost in the music now, remembering what it felt like to let the piano be her voice, to say things through melody that words could never express. As the nocturne came to its peaceful conclusion, Maria didn't stop. Instead, she transitioned seamlessly into something completely different, a jazz arrangement of Autumn Leaves that she'd taught herself from an old recording she'd found at the library years ago. The change in style was dramatic. Where the Chopin had been gentle and flowing, the jazz was bold and confident. Maria's left hand established a steady, swinging rhythm while her right hand began to explore the melody, playing with it, bending it, making it dance. She could feel the audience shifting behind her, surprised by the sudden change. This wasn't what they'd expected from a simple piece of classical music. This was something that required a completely different set of skills, understanding of chord progressions, improvisation, the ability to interpret a standard in a fresh way. Maria smiled as she played, feeling more like herself than she had in years. The jazz piece let her show off in ways the classical music didn't. She threw in runs and flourishes, played with the timing, added her own harmonic colors. This was the kind of playing that came from hours of experimentation, from loving the music so much that you had to make it your own. The kitchen door had opened fully now, and she could see some of the cooks standing in the doorway, amazed expressions on their faces. Mr. Romano had emerged from his office, drawn by the sound. The elderly couple had moved to a table closer to the piano. Even the family with children had sat back down, the kids' eyes wide with wonder. But it was the reaction from David Kim's table that mattered most to Maria. She couldn't see them. Her back was to them as she played. But she could sense the shift in energy. The loud, dismissive conversation had stopped entirely. Richard's confident pronouncements about real musicians had been replaced by stunned silence. As the jazz arrangement wound down, Maria felt a surge of confidence that surprised her. She'd proven her point. She could play, really play at a level that demanded respect. But something inside her wasn't satisfied yet. The classical piece and the jazz had been warm-ups, demonstrations of technique and musicality. Now she wanted to show them what she was really capable of. Without pause, Maria launched into the opening of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. Not the full orchestral version, of course. She was alone at the piano. But she'd spent months years ago working out a solo arrangement, trying to capture both the sweeping melodies and the powerful accompaniment in a way that could be played by one person. The opening chords were dramatic and bold, filling the restaurant with their rich, complex harmonies. This was music that demanded everything from a pianist: technical skill, emotional depth, physical stamina. The kind of piece that separated serious players from casual hobbyists. Maria's hands moved with increasing speed and confidence across the keyboard. The left hand thundered through the powerful bass lines while the right hand soared through the famous melody that had made this concerto one of the most beloved pieces in the classical repertoire. She could feel the music building, growing in intensity, demanding more and more from her. This was the piece that had always challenged her the most. Even in her best days, when she was practicing regularly, Rachmaninoff pushed her to her limits. The composer had famously large hands, and he'd written music that stretched across the keyboard in ways that were difficult for smaller hands to manage. But Maria had worked for months to find fingerings that worked for her, to develop the strength and speed needed to play the piece properly. Now, 4 years later, she was playing it better than she ever had. The time away hadn't weakened her skills. Somehow it had allowed her to approach the music with fresh ears and deeper understanding. Every phrase had meaning. Every dramatic gesture served a purpose in the larger story the music was telling. The restaurant had become a concert hall. People had stopped what they were doing and were listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for professional performances. Maria could feel their amazement, their respect, their growing realization that they were witnessing something special. But most importantly, she could feel her own joy returning. This was what had been missing from her life for 4 years, this sense of complete connection to something larger than herself. The piano wasn't just an instrument under her fingers, it was an extension of her soul, a way to communicate feelings and ideas that couldn't be expressed any other way. The concerto built to its powerful climax, Maria's hands flying across the keys with precision and passion. She'd practiced this section hundreds of times years ago, but tonight it felt effortless. Every note rang out clearly, every phrase connected to the next in one continuous flow of musical thought. Behind her, she could hear someone gasp as she navigated a particularly challenging passage. The rapid octaves in the left hand, the cascading runs in the right. These were the kinds of technical challenges that separated professional pianists from everyone else. And Maria was playing them flawlessly, with the kind of musical understanding that comes only from years of dedicated study and practice. As the piece moved into its gentle middle section, Maria allowed herself to show her interpretive skills. This was where the music became personal, where each pianist could bring their own emotional understanding to the composer's notes. She played with subtle timing variations, delicate touches of pedal, moments of silence that spoke as powerfully as the notes themselves. The elderly woman at the corner table had tears in her eyes. One of the cooks was shaking his head in amazement. Mr. Romano stood frozen by his office door, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't believe this was happening in his restaurant. But it was the silence from David Kim's table that spoke loudest of all. These people who had spent the evening dismissing anyone without formal training, who had been so confident that real music was beyond the reach of ordinary people, had been struck completely speechless. Maria moved into the final section of her arrangement, the music building once again to its triumphant conclusion. Her hands moved with absolute confidence now. Every technical challenge met with ease, every musical phrase shaped with intention and skill. This was what Mrs. Peterson had always told her, that true musicianship wasn't about perfect technique or expensive education. It was about having something to say and finding a way to say it through your instrument. The final chords rang out across the restaurant, rich and powerful, and absolutely perfect. Maria held the last note, letting it fade naturally into the silence that followed. Then she lifted her hands from the keys and sat quietly for a moment, feeling the music still vibrating through her body. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Maria could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the attention of everyone in the restaurant focused on her. She had done it. She had proven to herself and to everyone else that she was a real musician, not because of where she'd studied or how much money she'd spent on lessons, but because music lived in her heart and flowed through her hands with truth and beauty. Then the applause began. It started with the elderly couple, their hands coming together in slow, appreciative claps. The kitchen staff joined in, then Mr. Romano, then the family with children. Soon the entire restaurant was applauding, and Maria could hear voices calling out "Bravo" and "Incredible." But the reaction that mattered most came from behind her. She turned around on the piano bench to see David Kim's table, and the expressions on their faces told her everything she needed to know. Richard, who had been so confident about the lack of real musicians in the room, looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face was pale, his wine glass forgotten in his hand. Patricia had her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Victoria was shaking her head slowly, as if she couldn't process what she'd just heard, and David Kim, the successful music producer who worked with famous. The applause seemed to go on forever, but eventually it began to fade, leaving Maria standing beside the piano in the warm glow of the restaurant's lights. She felt different somehow, lighter, as if she'd been carrying a heavy weight for years, without realizing it, and had suddenly set it down. David Kim was the first to break the silence that followed the applause. He stood up from his table, his expression still showing the amazement that had crossed his face during her performance. He started, then paused, seeming to search for the right words. "That was absolutely extraordinary. Where did you study?" The question hung in the air, and Maria could feel everyone in the restaurant waiting for her answer. This was the moment she'd always feared, when someone would ask about her credentials, her training, her background, when she'd have to admit that she didn't have the fancy education or impressive resume that people like David Kim expected. But standing there, Still feeling the music resonating through her body, Maria realized she wasn't afraid anymore. She looked directly at David Kim and smiled. "I didn't study anywhere formal," she said simply. "I taught myself." The words seemed to hit David Kim like a physical blow. He blinked several times, as if he couldn't process what she'd just said. "You had taught yourself? All of that, the Chopin, the jazz arrangement, the Rachmaninoff, you learned that on your own?" "Well, not completely on my own," Maria said, thinking of Mrs. Peterson. "I had some help when I was younger, but no conservatory, no formal lessons, just a lot of practice and a love for music." Richard, who had been silent since her performance began, finally found his voice. But instead of the confident, dismissive tone he'd used all evening, his words came out shaky and uncertain. "The technique you showed, the musical interpretation, how is that even possible without proper training?" He wasn't asking to be condescending now. He seemed genuinely confused, as if everything he'd believed about music education had just been turned upside down. Maria looked at him, and instead of anger, she felt something like pity. "Music isn't just about training," she said gently. "It's about feeling. It's about having something to say and finding a way to say it. You can learn technique from books and teachers, but the music itself, that has to come from inside you." Patricia, who had spent the evening agreeing with every dismissive comment about amateur musicians, spoke up in a voice barely above a whisper. I owe you an apology. We all do. The things we said tonight about people without formal training, we were so wrong." "You didn't know," Maria said, and she meant it. "But maybe this will help you remember that talent can show up anywhere, sometimes in places you'd never expect to find it." David Kim had been quiet during this exchange, but Maria could see the wheels turning in his head. Finally, he spoke up, and his voice carried a note of excitement that hadn't been there before. "I have to ask, are you performing anywhere? Do you have any recordings? Because what I just heard on that level of musicianship needs to be shared with more people." Maria laughed, a sound that held both joy and a touch of sadness. "I'm not performing anywhere, I work here. This is actually the first time I've played in public in years." "But why?" Victoria asked, and her question seemed genuine, not judgmental. "With talent like that, why aren't you pursuing music professionally?" It was a fair question, and Maria took a moment to think about how to answer it. "Life gets in the way sometimes," she said finally. "There are bills to pay, family to help. Music was something I did for myself, for the love of it. I never thought about making it a career." David Kim stepped closer, and Maria could see the excitement building in his eyes. "What if I told you that could change? What if I told you there might be opportunities for someone with your abilities?" "What do you mean?" "I'm putting together a showcase next month," David explained, his words coming faster now as his enthusiasm grew. "It's called Hidden Voices. The whole concept is finding talented musicians who've been overlooked by the traditional music industry. Musicians like you who have the skill and the passion but haven't had the right opportunities." Maria felt her heart skip a beat. "You want me to perform? In front of an audience?" "I want you to perform in front of the right audience," David said. "Music industry people, journalists, other artists, people who understand what real talent sounds like regardless of where it comes from." "But I'm just a waitress," Maria said, the old doubts creeping back in. "No," said a voice from across the restaurant. It was the elderly woman from the corner table who had been listening to the entire conversation. "You're a musician who happens to work as a waitress. There's a big difference." The woman approached, moving slowly but with dignity. "My name is Helen Morrison," she said. "I was a music teacher for 45 years before I retired. I've heard thousands of students play from beginners to advanced. What you just did, that wasn't just playing piano. That was artistry." Maria felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you. That means more to me than you know." "I have one question," Helen continued. "Who taught you to feel the music that way? Because that's not something you can learn from books or videos. Someone showed you how to let the music speak through you." "Mrs. Peterson," Maria said softly. She was my neighbor when I was growing up. She taught me that music isn't about perfection, it's about truth. Helen nodded knowingly. Mrs. Peterson sounds like she was a very wise teacher. She would be proud of what you did tonight. Mr. Romano, who had been standing by his office door through most of this conversation, finally walked over. Maria tensed, suddenly remembering that she was supposed to be working, that she'd essentially abandoned her job to play piano. "Maria," he said, and his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "In 4 years of working here, why didn't you ever tell me you could play like that?" I didn't think it mattered," she said. "It wasn't relevant to my job." "Not relevant," Mr. Romano laughed, but it wasn't a mean laugh. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for the restaurant, having live music like that? Maria, you've been hiding your light under a bushel." David Kim pulled out a business card and handed it to Maria. "Think about the showcase," he said. "It's in 3 weeks, just one performance, maybe 20 minutes, of music. You choose what you want to play. But I think you could really make an impact." Maria took the card with trembling hands. David Kim, the same man whose friends had spent the evening dismissing people like her, was offering her a chance to perform for music industry professionals. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes," urged Patricia. "After what? We heard tonight you owe it to yourself and to everyone who loves music to share this gift." Richard, who had been quietly thoughtful since her performance, finally spoke up. "I need to say something," he began. "The things I said tonight about people without formal training, about real musicians, I was wrong. Not just a little wrong, but completely, fundamentally wrong." He looked directly at Maria. "You've shown me that music isn't about where you studied or how much money you spent on lessons. It's about the passion and dedication you bring to it. You've been studying all your life, maybe not in a classroom, but in the way that really matters. I'd like to write about this," he continued. "I'm a music critic for the city paper. Would you mind if I told your story? I think people need to hear about what happened here tonight." Maria looked around the restaurant, at David Kim with his business card and his offer of a showcase, at Richard wanting to write about her, at Helen Morrison nodding encouragingly, at Mr. Romano beaming with pride, at her co-workers peeking out from the kitchen with amazement still written on their faces. 6 months ago, if someone had told her this would happen, she would have laughed. But standing there, surrounded by the afterglow of her performance, it all felt perfectly natural. This was what happened when you finally stopped hiding who you really were. "Yes," she said, looking at David Kim. "Yes, I'll do the showcase. And yes," she said to Richard, "you can write about tonight. But do me a favor, don't just write about me. Write about all the people out there who have talents they're hiding. Write about Mrs. Peterson and teachers like her who see potential in unlikely places. Write about the idea that music belongs to everyone, not just people with expensive educations." Richard smiled, a real smile, not the smug expression he'd worn earlier in the evening. "I think I can do that." Over the next hour, as the restaurant finally closed and the last customers left, Maria found herself surrounded by people who wanted to talk about music, about her performance, about what came next. David Kim gave her his personal phone number and made her promise to call him the next day to discuss details for the showcase. Helen Morrison invited her to coffee, saying she'd love to hear more about Mrs. Peterson and Maria's musical journey. Even Richard and Patricia and Victoria, the same people who had been so dismissive earlier, stayed to talk. They asked about her favorite pieces, her influences, her thoughts on different composers. They treated her like a colleague, a fellow musician, someone whose opinions mattered. As the evening finally wound down and people began to leave, Maria found herself alone with the piano once more. But this time, instead of being decoration gathering dust in the corner, it felt like a friend, a partner who had helped her reclaim herself.